Welcome to the Pool Solutions DIY help videos. In these videos we will help you to restore your swimming pool to look like the one you can see in these pictures. And now this is what the swimming pool looked like before. We have shown you in another video how to grind and prepare the surface, filling up with underwater pool patching all the cracks and openings. And that was the tiles after we've sanded them a bit. We then coated those tiles with a clear coat solution. That was after cleaning and coating the tiles with a clear coat. Now we will be starting with the paint process, and as you can see, after mixing the primer in the correct 3:1 ratio, we've started cutting in along the bottom line of the tiles with a brush. And as you can hear, every job has got its perks with a nice sound of the birds in the background. And you need a steady hand for that. Then coating the rest of the surface with a primer. After covering the whole surface with primer, check every 10 minutes for dry spots that might appear where the primer was absorbed. Wet these spots again with primer so that the whole surface has a wet look, as we want to apply a top coat, the first top coat, onto this still wet sticky primer layer. And this is after approximately 1.5 to 2 hours. Yes, that's a problem. And that now needs a solution, because that primer is quite tacky and sticky and slippery, and we don't want to go on there. But with a little bit of help and the heads put together, there was a solution to this little problem as well. And all back to normal, we can proceed with a paint job. There we're starting with the first top coat onto a wet primer. We've given it 1.5 to 2 hours in the winter to become a little bit sticky, and then apply the first top coat, also mixed in the correct 3:1 ratio, on top of the damp wet primer, which is important to create a strong bond from the first top coat down into the substrate that is now penetrated by that primer layer. Test the primer under the fingers. When it becomes a little bit sticky in some places, you can apply the top coat about after 1 to 2 hours. It's quite slippery, as you can see here. So you have to be steady on your feet or make use of spike shoes to walk on the wet primer. But we are getting along well with the gumboots here and with extension poles to help ease the job a bit. That is the next day. The coating is now hard and set, a little bit glossy, still patchy. But we can clean that now if there's leaves or rainwater or anything in the pool, and then start with a sanding of the whole surface. And that is important, using 60 grit sandpaper to break the gloss. Just scratch it a bit to create a good mechanical bond for the next layer. This is the longer process where we left the coating to dry overnight. Sand it and then proceed with the next top coat layer. And you will now see how the color will start to come out very solid. You can apply more thickly now on this sanded layer. Again, be careful for teardrops. And there's the finished result after the second coat. And of course, the same procedure is followed. Leave it to dry overnight, sand it a bit the next day to break the gloss, and apply the final coat. And this is the final result of that. Before we proceed to the rest of these videos, let's quickly just have a look at a few important points. First of all, these videos are not complete. They are not that detailed. It's a short overview of the process, so you can see what lies ahead and get a feeling for the project. But always read and follow the written application instructions, which is very complete. And that is always rule 1. Read the instructions. Right, let's look at the next point. Mix the epoxy A and B components in small quantities. Beware that the product has a pot life. It's a epoxy, so there's a resin and a curing agent that will react with each other, and it will set in the bucket during very hot conditions. That might be as low as 10 minutes. During winter times and lower temperatures, there's a dramatic increase in pot life, and it can be 1 hour or more. That's why the next point is also important. Keep the components cool. So when you store these components next to the swimming pool or wherever you are working, keep it in the shadow or under roof, and keep it as cool as possible. Also, it helps to paint early in the morning. It's much better. The swimming pool surface is cooler to work on. It will give you a little bit more time to work. And also when you mix the components and the part A and part B components are not that warm, it will extend the lifespan of the product in the bucket. While when applied on the swimming pool surface, of course, the drying time on the surface will be much longer, in the region of 4 to 6 hours to dry completely. In very hot conditions, of course, you might even consider using a large bucket with ice and put the buckets with the components in there. Keep it cool, so that when you mix the components together, it will extend the pot life dramatically. We had cases where the product did set in the bucket and people added all the epoxies together, not working in small quantities, and they got a nice mold out of that bucket, which is unusable. Of course, you can use it as a door stopper or a small chair for children, and you will be the only person with such a unique, wonderful object, but it won't help your pool project. So yes, keep in mind the pot life and keeping the components cool. Right, never paint over wet and damp areas in the pool. When you've emptied the pool and you started grinding and sanding, watch out for moist penetrating from the outside, causing wet spots on the pool. Allow these to dry completely. If there's a continuous flow of moist out of certain spots on the surface, it's not on all pools that we do experience this, but there is a percentage of pools which do suffer this condition, where there's high levels of water around the pool, and it penetrates through cracks and the surface material. You need to open this up, grind it open, or drill a hole right through the swimming pool side at the bottom of these wet spots, and just drain that water table a bit on the outside before you paint the pool over those areas. Do not paint on brittle or weak substrates. In many cases where the marbleite has become brittle or soft, the epoxy will penetrate that substrate and create a hardened layer inside the substrate, and it might later crack loose when the marbleite is not strong or hard, and you don't want that. So sandy surfaces cannot be painted. Your plaster surface must be hard and solid and able to sustain a painted layer. Of course, the epoxy paint do set into a very hard, glossy, almost a porcelain-like finish. You can't scratch it, you can't remove it by itself, but if it breaks loose from the surface, it will normally be because there is a weak marbleite or plastered surface behind, and 2 or 3 millimeter of that sandy surface will break loose with the epoxy paint layer. And then, of course, mix the correct components, part A and part B of the epoxy. Part A being the resin and part B the curing agent. And of course, you have two products in the set that we supply. There is a top coat part A and B, and there's a primer part A and B. And of course, top coat A is always mixed with top coat B, and primer A with primer B. Don't intermix. Mix in the right quantities, and the mixing ratio is indicated in our application instructions and on the buckets. Make sure that you separate the top coat from the primer when you start the project. Start with the primer, put the top coat aside so there's no accidents mixing wrong components together. Then of course, a good point, stir the part A components separately before mixing with the curing agent, the part B. It's a good thing to always stir up the pigments, the solvents, mix it in well in the bucket that we supply or in a separate bucket, but do stir the part A that contains the pigments and the solvents and a lot of quartz that's in there. Just stir it up and keep a good mix throughout the project so your product stays the same and the color stays the same throughout the paint project. Always sand any dried and hardened layers before overcoating. Important point, the epoxy will set into a very glossy surface once it dried overnight, and the coatings to follow will not stick well to it. Just break that gloss a bit, scratch the gloss a bit. It's not important to sand that deep on it, but it must be sanded everywhere. Don't skip spots, as that might compromise the interlayer bonding of the product. If you follow the short method where the epoxy coat is applied while it's still damp and wet, of course you don't have to sand in between. We hope you enjoyed this, and we will soon have more videos for you to watch.